Hi, Savannah.
Hi, Ryan.
What are we talking about today?
Today we're talking about Degrassi, the next generation.
Whatever it takes.
First off, we just want to remind everybody about our giveaway that we have going on. It's kind of a take on a giveaway because really just if you participate, you will likely get something until we run out. So for this giveaway, you can get a exclusive Pokemon card from Ryan's collection that she will hand pick for you that shows your true aura and self. So all you have to do to get one of these Pokemon cards is to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Instagram. Just send us a screenshot of you doing all these things, either on our Instagram, you can DM us, or if you're really not an Instagram person, all you have to do is leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and subscribe to us on YouTube. You can email us a screenshot of those as well. Our email is in our description of our videos.
I promise I have some rares in there. I'd also like to thank our patrons. So thank you so much for supporting us through Patreon. Upcoming this month, we do have another exclusive video coming out at the $10 tier. So consider that. It's going to be all about my dogs, my retired racing greyhounds. You'll learn about the politically charged term retired versus rescued. So stay tuned.
That sounds pretty interesting to me. And she has really cute dogs, so definitely worth checking out. We also just want to take a quick moment to thank our sponsors. We have gotten some anonymous sponsors to help us out on the podcast, so we just want to thank them and let them know that we really appreciate them.
Yes. Thank you, Batman. Oh, Savannah, was I not supposed to say that?
It's okay. He won't know.
And again, we just want to remind you to like and subscribe. It helps us so much. And we appreciate every single comment you leave. And subscribe to us on all platforms. Support us everywhere. We really appreciate it. But anyways, on to our next thing here.
So today is kind of an exciting episode because we're kind of launching a new mini-series within our podcast. So this mini-series is going to be all about teen-related content. So this might be teen shows, teen YA novels, movies, really anything that is either made for or is about teenagers from any period of time. I think that this is a genre of content that both Ryan and I are really interested in and just generally enjoy for all of our lives probably. So this new series is going to be called Teenybopper Tuesdays. And these will just be kind of like sprinkled in amongst our other podcast content.
So like we stated earlier, we're going to be talking about Degrassi, the next generation, seasons 1 through 5, 1 through 6. So heavy spoilers for all of that. So keep that in mind. If you are worried about being spoiled about like a 20-year-old show, I doubt you are. Everyone knows that Drake gets shot. Apparently, allegedly.
And also, I have seen, I think, through seasons 11, possibly, so I might let something slip past season 5 or 6 also, so just take note.
Yeah, I would say that after season 6, I don't know if it's super worth watching, to be honest. It kind of got a little repetitive already. But trigger warning, Degrassi does go there. They talk about a lot of hard-hitting topics like abortion, self-harm, and school shooting. So if you are sensitive to any of that, we can warn you about what we're going to talk about in specific episodes, and we can provide timestamps below to where to skip to if you wanted to skip that subject.
All right, and with that, let's go ahead and jump right in to Degrassi. So a little bit of background about this show. Degrassi, the Next Generation came out initially in 2002 and it ran through 2015. In the first 1 through 9 seasons, it is called Degrassi, the Next Generation, but then after that, it was just rebranded as being Degrassi, but it was essentially the same show. There's a little bit of a discrepancy of once it became just Degrassi, it was more of an actual like soap opera style show versus the original nature of the show being a little different. But it's basically the same thing. Degrassi is a spin-off of the Kids of Degrassi Street, Degrassi Junior High, and Degrassi High, which started in the 70s and went through the 80s. and it was created by Linda Schuyler and Kit Hood, originally in 1979. These were kind of after-school specials that were aired in Canada. This is a Canadian TV show, which we will talk about a little bit more. It was all originally based on those shows, and then in about 2000, they decided to bring it back to today's era. In 2002, Degrassi The Next Generation came back again with Linda Schuyler. She has really worked on the show throughout its entire run. It was also in this iteration created by Yan Moore. And kind of funnily enough, they got the name The Next Generation from Star Trek The Next Generation. And that was kind of what they were basing it off of. So I was amused by that when I learned that fact. And as I said, this is a Canadian show. It was aired on CTV. In the United States, Degrassi aired on PBS as well as The N, which was a Viacom channel. The N is kind of like the teenage version of Nickelodeon, essentially. So the show is set in Toronto, Ontario, and it follows the lives of teenagers all the way from junior high through college. The show is really inspired by Degrassi Junior High, where one of the characters has a baby in high school, and this is going to be the character Emma in Degrassi The Next Generation, and it's kind of like the telling of her life then, like what has happened. A lot of the original cast that was in these original Degrassi shows then ends up being parents in Degrassi The Next Generation and kind of continues on their story. Degrassi has received quite a bit of critical success. It's also been, it's gotten quite a bit of favorable reviews from things like Entertainment Weekly and the New York Times. In 2004, one episode alone received just under 1 million views in Canada, as well as 500,000 viewers in the United States. So it's fair to say that's pretty popular of a show. It's also been the subject of controversy in the way that it's depicted different social issues. And it's really known for being a real depiction of teen life. We'll kind of get into whether or not that is or is not real, but that's what the media kind of said. They were awarded for being real. We'll discuss this a little bit more, but there are several episodes that were not aired in the United States originally because of it being too real, which is kind of interesting. And the final installment of Degrassi did first air in 2016 on Netflix and in Canada as well. And it has now been canceled. In 2019, it was canceled by Netflix. And that is supposedly the last and final run of the Degrassi franchise. But I kind of would believe that it wouldn't be the end. I kind of feel like something new might come out one day. But that is all of the background information that I have on Degrassi. So before we get into the specifics of Degrassi, RIan, I'm a little interested to know any of your background you might have with the show or just with teen dramas in general. I know I've been a lifelong fan of the show, but I know that you have not. So I would like to kind of hear your thoughts of interacting with it when it was first on TV.
Yeah, I mean, I knew that you watched Degrassi, but I didn't think you, seriously watched it or that it was a serious show to watch. I didn't know that it was so, continual. I really just, I had a great aversion to watching it. Kind of like Dawson's Creek. I was just very... I didn't care about it, honestly. I didn't know anyone who was in it. I knew that Drake was in it just from kind of general knowledge when Drake started to become a thing. And I didn't even know that he was such a big character. I thought he was kind of a minor role in the whole thing. My forte is definitely more in the young adult book category. I read a lot in that day and age, and I didn't really watch a lot of TV as a youth. I would say the closest thing I got to it is probably Zoe 101, which my mother made me stop watching during the final season when Jamie Lynn Spears got pregnant. So shout out to you, Mom. I still watched it.
Which, funnily enough, I think I was not actually allowed to watch Degrassi when I very first started watching it. I know my mom had reservations about the show, and I think she kind of said that she didn't want me to watch it, but not in a very strict way. So I just ended up watching it anyways. Because I think I probably started watching Degrassi when I was 10 or 11, maybe. When I was in late elementary school, early junior high. And I just like really liked the show. I liked the drama in it. As a kid, I thought it was like just entertaining for me to watch. And just in general, I have just always really liked teen dramas. I have watched many of them, although I haven't seen like a lot of like the original OG shows like Dawson's Creek or The OC or Gossip Girl. I haven't seen any of those, but like I loved Skins and I love My So-Called Life and a lot of other shows like that. And I also really enjoyed reading YA books at that time that had kind of similar content. Most specifically, I loved like all of the Meg Cabot books. Those ones were my favorite. Don't give me that look, Ryan.
Like, out of all the books you have to, like, shout out to.
They were my favorite during that time. And I feel like they're, like, in the same vein a little bit. But yeah, so I've definitely always loved Degrassi. To the point when Drake came out as a rapper, it was, like, really weird to me to see him in that way, because I had just always known him as Jimmy.
Yeah, and also I wanted to mention the network The N seemed really intimidating to me, the way it was advertised. It was always kind of like, I don't know, it was like black and red, and I watched Noggin. So Noggin and The N shared the same channel on like DirecTV, and Nickelodeon was its own separate thing. And I remember like in transitioning from like Noggin in the daytime to The N for teens post school, I would like change the channel because Max and Ruby were over and I was not ready for The N.
I'm pretty sure I still also watch Noggin while also watching The N. I don't know. I was just really there for all of the Nickelodeon channels at the time. I feel like that was like prime time with DirecTV.
So I, in the last 2 weeks, have binge watched over 60 episodes of Degrassi. So pat me on the back, Savannah. I'm not going to make you do anything even equivalent to that. You are not going to spend as much time as I did watching Degrassi on anything that I'm going to make you watch. I just want that to be said now.
I don't know why you're so upset about it. I feel like it would have been enjoyable.
You would think the topics we're going to be talking about, the story arcs, are Manny and her aversion story arc, Ellie and her self-harm, and then Rick and the school shooting, which I feel like we could not talk about. It is the Degrassi episodes. I mean, everyone knows that Drake gets shot, so that's what we'll be talking about. So here we go. But moving on, we're going to talk about Manny and her abortion and that storyline. So please, if you would like to skip to the next portion of the podcast, we can leave a timestamp here in the corner or in the links down below. So please keep an eye on that. And if you're listening to this as well, we will post-edit a timestamp to skip to as well.
So first, we are going to get into Manny, who my outfit is inspired by today. Manny is my favorite character on the show, and for many different reasons. Maybe we'll get into that a little bit. So first, before I think we can really talk about what happened with Manny and getting her abortion, I think we have to kind of first like look at everything that led up to that in the show specifically, because I think it's important. So when Manny first comes onto the show, she is young. She's in junior high. I believe she's only like 11 or 12. And she's just kind of like a sweet, innocent girl. And then as the show progresses through about season 3, I would say, she really has kind of a turning point where in the show they frame it as like she wants to basically like alter her image so that way she can get more attention from boys. And so at that point in the show, they kind of start to like sex her up a little bit with her outfits and the ways that she interacts with boys.
The gateway rift is cheerleading.
And kind of as an aside that's a little interesting, Cassie Steele, the actress who plays Manny, she talks about, I've seen in interviews, how she kind of felt like that was not like her at all. So that in itself is kind of interesting that they chose to do that on the show, like to sexualize her in that way and make her wear things in that way that an actual girl that real age would not want to be wearing. And then as this kind of progresses, Manny begins to have relationships on the show. One of the most notable ones, especially in this particular vein, is her relationship with Craig. So originally when Manny starts to hang out with Craig, they go on a date, and then he decides that he feels like she's too young for him and like too much of a little kid. And Craig is older than her, I believe by 1 year, possibly 2 years. And
1 year.
Yeah. And so they don't date. I believe this happens in season 2. And then by season 3, when Manny starts to change her image, that's when Craig kind of decides that, oh, Manny isn't a little kid anymore because she is dressing differently and acting differently. And so that's when they begin to have a relationship, while Craig is also in another relationship with his girlfriend, Ashley. So Manny becomes kind of like the side chick, if you will, for Craig, which leaves Manny to be in many compromising situations where she feels hurt because she's not having the relationship that she wants, but she feels so determined to be with Craig anyways, which leads to them eventually having sex, which then leads to Manny getting pregnant. And then once Manny starts to have some wonderings about whether or not she might be pregnant after having sex with Craig, she ends up reaching out to Emma's mom because, as I mentioned before, Emma's mom was one of the original cast members of the show, and her whole storyline was about how she got pregnant and then she had Emma. So she trusts Emma's mom, Emma is her best friend, to kind of walk her through this process of having to take a pregnancy test, trying to kind of decide what to do. She realizes that she is in fact pregnant, and she eventually tells Craig. And at first they kind of decide to keep the baby together. Like, they think that they're going to be able to raise it, even though Manny's only 14, Craig is only like 15 or 16. So for like a brief moment, they think that they want to have it, but then after having to help babysit, they realize, like, or at least Manny realizes, that this is not the life for her. She doesn't feel like she is old enough to be able to do this. She doesn't want to have the baby anymore. And so she gets some help from Emma's mom, and she ends up talking to her own mom, and she ends up going through with the abortion.
The critical reception of these episodes were mixed. In the US, they were considered to be too honest, and so the N chose to not show those episodes, or refuse to show those episodes. It did cause an uproar among the fans of the community. They did sign a petition to try to get the show back on air, and it got a lot of media attention in Canada and the US. Up until this point, abortion is kind of a taboo subject in television, even to this day. A lot of women in television do consider getting an abortion, but ultimately, most of the time they decide against it. So for abortion to be chosen as a viable option, especially as a 14-year-old child, getting an abortion was really shocking and revelatory for the time, I would say.
Yeah, and also they would be shown as either thinking about getting an abortion and then deciding not to, or they would get it and then they would have regret afterwards. So in this, Manny doesn't show any signs of regret after she has the abortion, and that in itself was deemed problematic by US audiences.
Yes, but I don't think that's super uncommon with a lot of the Degrassi plot lines. If you take into account a lot of other people problems, a lot of, like, Emma's anorexia, I feel like kind of fell off the face of the planet. Or I'm trying to think of some other things. Goodness gracious, never mind. Maybe I don't have as many examples as I thought of this, so maybe we can just cut it. But I feel like it's not unusual. Like, it's just they're taking it personally because it's abortion and not something else.
In that episode, I rewatched that episode last night, and she specifically says at the end, like, I'm gonna be okay. And I think from what I've read, more often in shows, when a character gets an abortion, she's like a wreck afterwards and feels horrible about it, because that's like our morals that we're trying to push onto people. Basically, that was what my understanding of it. And
gotcha.
Also, kind of interestingly, the Viacom network they said that they were not banning these episodes in the US because they felt like they were, like, it was against their own political leanings. They just said it was, like, too much, basically, which was kind of a weird answer to me that they would say, but I don't know, they were just trying to be diplomatic, I guess, about it. And then I do just want to note, so this episode came out originally in Canada in 2003. So in order to kind of think about this in context, I would invite you, if you were alive at the time, to think back to 2003 and what our conversations were around abortion and teen pregnancy here in the United States. And it was shown eventually on the end, but it wasn't until 3 years later, so 2006. And when this happened, Viacom and the End, they tried to not necessarily promote it. They more so had a marathon and campaign of Degrassi where they just said it was like every episode ever. And that was just it. They weren't specifically saying that they were airing these episodes for the first time.
Oh, that's a interesting campaign to say that you chose to not run specific episodes, and now you are. Yeah, very diplomatic of them, if you ask me. Moving on, do we want to talk about our kind of personal feelings about this episode and kind of what we can think about and gain what these episodes reflect back onto us?
So first off, I think it's important to note the differences between Canada and the US, specifically how it deals with issues of abortion and teen pregnancy. So in Canada, since 1969, abortion has been legal, and since 1982, there's essentially been no legal restrictions on abortion in Canada. If you're from the United States, you know that's not how it is here. In 1973, we had Roe v. Wade, which allowed for some access to abortion to be allowed here at a federal level, but states themselves still really hold most of the control over who is allowed to have an abortion, when, and how, basically. So it's very, very different conversations that are being had within these two countries, which I think has led to this discrepancy of where it is allowed to be shown, these episodes. While also in Canada, it seems as though since the 80s, abortion rates have been like pretty steady there, most likely because of like the ease of access and less stigma around abortion. Whereas here in the United States, we have had lowering rates of abortion since the 70s. And this is likely due to having more access to birth control and things of that nature. But it's very much still a contested topic, and pretty much it seems like at least once a week we hear about some state trying to come after abortion rights and trying to limit them in some way. We also just want to note there's a big difference in teen pregnancy as well. The United States has one of the highest rates of teen pregnancy amongst all industrialized countries in the world. And this likely has to do with really poor sex education in schools and just still lack of access to birth control. As it's getting easier, it's still not generally easy to get. Where in Canada, it's a little different. It still is not like perfect, but they have generally lower rates of teen pregnancy in Canada as well. And one last thing, just to note that even while in the US we have all of these like really extreme moments of people trying to fight against abortion or people being very vocal about being pro-choice or pro-life, with all that said, we still have pretty much always aired on the majority of people statistically being okay with some level of abortion. So that is still true for our country. Those are just not the people who are the most vocal most of the time.
So having said all that, I don't know when you watched that episode, but I kind of want you to get into when you first watched that episode, what age you were, and the background that we come from. Like you said, we are in Arizona. We live in an environment where a lot of people that we meet day to day are pro-life. I don't even like that term. And I can recall going to high school and there being tablers for pro-life, like showing off, like, this is the baby's heartbeat. Here, you can have this. There's a little baby heartbeat at whatever week, 6 weeks. And like, I remember pocketing that. And I don't really think I had an opinion or anything on abortion until probably senior year of high school. So watching these groups of episodes with Manny, were you shocked? What were your kind of initial thoughts, if you can bring yourself back?
I'm trying to remember if I very specifically remember watching the abortion episodes with Manny as a kid. I probably would have been like 12 or 13 at the time watching them. And I think just in general, seeing abortion, I was not like scandalized by that, I guess you could say, as a kid. I think it sounded just kind of like scary, I guess. That scaredness, fear. That fear probably just came from like just not really understanding like maybe what that word meant or what the implications were of that. I do feel like, kind of interestingly, I feel like in like the early 2000s and 2010s, like there was just all of a sudden a lot of media about teen pregnancy here in the US with shows like Teen Mom and Juno and The Secret Life of the American Teenager, just like a lot of content about teen moms. And I don't know, I liked that content, and I don't know if I just liked it because it seemed like taboo. I think I've always just been like, I've always kind of leaned into that kind of content because it was like, ooh, well, this is bad, so I want to learn about it. I think that there was like kind of some of that feeling. And I think part, like maybe a little bit of rebellion of things like the outcry against Jamie Lynn Spears and Zoe 101, like you mentioned, being like, ooh, well, this is bad, so I want to watch it.
I can attest. Yes, you were 100% into the pregnancy shows. I didn't really get it. I think my inner misogynist was like, those are all dumb girls who got pregnant. I don't need to watch that. I mean, with some things I wanted to see just because my mom didn't want me to watch it, like Zoe 101, like Juno. I think we had to lie to my mom to go see that in the theater, or swayed her. I'm not really sure.
Your mom got mad at my mom afterwards.
Yeah. I know, I'm not making my mom look great this episode. But yeah, in general, I think I was kind of like indifferent. I was more concerned about, real girls and their real problems with their magic swords and taking down corrupt governments. So that's way more important than teen pregnancy. At least in my 13-year-old brain it was.
Yeah, and specifically here in Arizona, I feel like our interactions with those things were probably just like skewed to begin with. Like how you were saying, like your inner misogynist of feeling like they were like dumb girls. I feel like even if our families didn't necessarily project that feeling, it was just kind of like everywhere, I would say. Both in the media broadly in the United States, but also just in Arizona specifically. Shit's kind of crazy here when you're dealing specifically with things like abortion or like teen moms or things like that. So it's I think we were just kind of primed already to kind of have those feelings, because I don't think you were alone in feeling that, because even while I was like interested in that type of content, I think still part of me did feel like they're the bad girls or something for doing that, but also I liked them. I liked the bad girls but thought it was wrong. I don't know, there's something complicated there and I'm not sure what it is.
Yeah, there is. I want to talk about it kind of watching it from a modern perspective all at once, and seeing Manny's character arc progress so quickly for me, because I watched it all in the span of 2 weeks, like I said. So it was very shocking to me to see Manny go to like this main character and just be so sexed up. I was kind of happy. I was a little bit like, do I want to see this 13-year-old body on screen like this? I think it's specifically the shot where she bends over wearing no underwear, and all like the boys lean over. So I had some mixed feelings about that. And I think that the way they handled the episode in general, I think still holds up today. I have some problems with the coding, and Manny specifically in choosing her to get pregnant. And I have some problems kind of her turning to Spike, because I think they're two kind of different characters. But we can get into that. I think watching Manny, as a younger person, if I were to see her, I would kind of be scandalized by her. I think that Emma would probably be more someone that I would want to attach onto, but not like it very much, because Emma is very annoying. Emma's like this rights activist, like blonde, skinny girl, stick, and I feel like white. And I feel like I would have wanted to have been most like Emma, and maybe secretly most like Manny. So the way Manny is coded, she is not white. Savannah has just informed me that she is Filipino, but her full name is Manuela Santos, and she is promiscuous, at least the way some other people see her and view her. Us as viewers, I'm not sure if we're supposed to get that necessarily, but I think that a lot of people could. I think that some people could see her as the school slut watching this. And she's kind of portrayed as this transgressive woman, and she's the one to have chosen to get an abortion. Not Spike, who in her own season was a good girl. She was kind, and we were supposed to empathize with her. I did not watch it. I just read a very compelling article about this. And then there was another girl to have gotten an abortion in the original Degrassi, and that was Tessa Campanelli. and she cheated on someone with one of the original cast members, Joey, and she chose to get an abortion. So they are two transgressive women, Manny and this Tessa person, choosing to get an abortion, not being remorseful about it. And then there's the opposite, where we have Spike and later on Liberty, who are extremely remorseful and don't go on with the abortion. And there's also that, I mean, in general, American coding, where people who look like browner skin, who are Filipino, who are Mexican, have that kind of like exotic, sultry undertone to them to begin with. So I'm not super comfortable with that racial coding as well, and choosing her to be that curvaceous, promiscuous character who is unremorseful about her abortions.
And to add to that, how that might in itself be kind of like stereotyping that this young girl who is not white would be the one to get accidentally pregnant as well. I think that
right.
That kind of falls.
I'm not saying that Manny is wrong either. I completely support her decision. I'm saying be as unremorseful as you want about abortions. But at the same time, they did choose that character to portray that. So that could come across as stereotyping Filipino women or non-white women.
I also think with this, like rewatching the episode now, the greater takeaway that I got from it was not so much like this is what we should warn teens about, because it is important to note, like Degrassi, a lot of its like formatting is kind of like to warn teens, or to be like a PSA almost about like, these are the issues that you might be facing, this is how you should deal with them. It seemed almost less a PSA about getting pregnant or having an abortion. This time around watching it, I took it more as being like, there was a major problem with sex education that led to this happening. Specifically, like Manny, when she was trying to figure out if she was pregnant, like she just honestly didn't like know. Like she didn't know like necessarily what to look for. She didn't necessarily know how to like communicate, to ask to have protection while she was having sex, or even like what that would be necessarily. And I have done a little bit of research into what sex education is like in Canada, and it sounds like it's generally okay, but it could be better. But like in the show, like they show them having kind of like your typical sex education that you see in TV and movies, where they're like putting a condom on a banana. But I remember in one episode specifically, like the teacher who's giving them like this lesson does actually kind of like answer some questions about that. Whereas here in the US, our sex education can be next to nothing, and sometimes in fact nothing, or not even scientifically accurate. So I think that kind of spoke to a larger issue for me when I was rewatching this.
Moving on to our next topic in our story arc is with Ellie and her cutting. So please, if you are triggered at all by self-harm, we will be mentioning what she did to cause the self-harm. Please feel free to skip to this timestamp. Again, it'll be posted in various places, so please feel free to skip on. So the episode where Ellie first cuts herself is in 2003. And I want to give a little bit of background on Ellie. She's kind of like a very tame goth girl. She has pale skin, straight red hair. She dresses in kind of that 2003 soft emo way. Savannah, would you say?
Yeah, like soft emo, soft punk-ish.
And so she has an alcoholic mom, and she goes to the protractor that she finds in her backpack. So she first cuts herself in her home, and she does end up bringing the cutting into the school. She gets caught by Paige, a preppy, blonde, teenage, bitch-like character in Degrassi, and Paige becomes helpful, actually. She reports Ellie's cutting, and Ellie is shown to counseling, and that's where she kind of makes her progress past this self-harm story arc.
So there's a lot to be said, I think, about the culture surrounding self-harm, specifically during this time period. But first, just to note, cutting specifically is most common amongst teen and young adults who self-harm. and it's especially common amongst girls specifically. And this often starts around the ages of 12 to 14. So this is about around the time that Ellie, her age was in the show.
They do show the physical, like cutting of her arm and the bleeding thereafter. So they do actually show what Ellie does, which I think is where the main controversy is. And I mean, this is one of the first shows early on. I've barely seen any shows where self-harm is addressed. So I don't know if you can think of any examples in your head, Savannah, that can even come around this time period.
So I can't think of any shows specifically that dealt with self-harm in this way. I did read a book around this time period called Cut by Patricia McCormick, and this came out in 2000, but I read it probably some years after that. But it's specifically about a girl who cuts herself and ends up having to go into an inpatient facility to try to help her with that. And it was a YA book.
I do think that the culture in 2003, 2000 to 2010, I would say, there was a kind of a glamorous association with self-harm and cutting in particular. At least in my mind, there was, with the emo culture that was around it. It felt like you were legit and real and felt real pain if you were to cut. I can recall some friends of mine who would cut, and I would be like convinced maybe to think about it one day just so I can be a part of that group. So I don't think this episode of Degrassi, at least for me, glamorizes it, even though there are some people who would say different, and we can get into that. But Savannah, did you kind of experience the same kind of atmosphere in high school?
Yeah, no, I would agree. I would say probably starting in 6th grade for me through junior high and part of high school, there was definitely a glamorizing of cutting. And I think most people who were kind of either scene kids or emo kids experienced some of that. And there was a lot of the glamorizing of it in music often, specifically. And I definitely knew people who did that. And I feel like there were times when I was like that age where I did feel like confused by my like mental health that I was dealing with, and really wondering like, oh, well, so many other people do this, so maybe this would like help me in some way if I were to do this too. So it definitely was a problematic thing to be, I think, glamorized in the way that it was during that time.
Yeah, and I think that since during this time period we were all affected by that, and watching Ellie do that to herself with her protractor of all things, and just her being a popular character, apparently that's what I read, I don't know for sure, I don't like Ellie, and her cutting herself, seeing that on screen and people wanting to be more like her, it's no surprise that there was a elementary school in Quebec where children aged 10 to 13 were reported to be cutting themselves with their protractor to emulate Ellie from Degrassi.
And this type of behavior is not necessarily uncommon. It's called modeling within psychology, which is when people do copy the behaviors that they see in media or that they just see happening around them. So like there's been instances of like celebrities committing suicide, and then larger communities of people also committing suicide afterwards, or just other modeling type behaviors in this way.
Yeah, and they don't exactly... They do paint Ellie as kind of a hero. I mean, she saves her mom from her burning house. She is kind of a cool character, and I could see myself liking her in my youth. Do you like Ellie, Savannah, now and then?
Then I feel like I was never like that into Ellie. I think part of me kind of felt like I was supposed to be since I was like into emo stuff during that time. But I think her character is just like not that compelling. Something rewatching the show now that I think is really interesting is that Ellie's character specifically feels very specific to that moment in time. Like her dad was away in Afghanistan in the military, and like just that whole time period with the self-harm, like that just all seems very specific to the 2000s and isn't maybe something that translates, I think, in the same way today. Like if a teen were to watch that today, I'm not sure. I don't really know what their interaction would be with it, but I don't think it would be like, I don't think they would necessarily have like the understanding of it as they do today. I don't know. I don't really see very much teen media like talking about self-harm nowadays?
I don't know either. I feel pretty in touch with the teens. There is some kind of bodily horror in Billie Eilish that I really like to watch and I appreciate. So I don't know if that is modeled and emulated in the youth of today. I'm sure there is a subgenre of self-harm TikTok that we're just missing here. But I don't think I want to look into that right now. But we can kind of move on. We don't feel like it's a super accurate representation of today. I kind of want to bring up a modern example that just completely got stomped on by critics and like YouTube and podcasts everywhere in general hated, which is 13 Reasons Why, a book by Jay Asher and translated by Netflix to a series. So Savannah, did you watch 13 Reasons Why?
No, I didn't.
I did, somewhat recently actually, about a couple years ago, and it was good TV, let me tell you. It was very addicting, but they did glamorize the main character who did commit suicide, and they showed her suicide in a 3-minute long scene detailing exactly how they did it. Just from some research, linked down below, various sources. Apparently the week after the release of the show, Google searches for how to commit suicide and just suicide in general increased to about 40%, and there was a jump in suicide rates among teens at about 0.5% than expected. We don't know for sure if it's completely like correlated with 13 Reasons Why, but a lot of people are speculating that it is.
Yeah, I've done some like very base level research into like what are the effects of seeing this type of media. Like I did mention like the modeling thing, like people do model behaviors off of like people that they see and things like that. But I know, like, I think the general consensus is that just, like, talking about self-harm or talking about suicide doesn't necessarily increase the likelihood that somebody will do that or will go through with that. But it seems kind of murky on whether or not it's visually seeing that. Like, seeing it, like you're talking about, completely shown out in 13 Reasons Why. It seems like that's actually might have like an effect on people and possibly leading them to go through with those things. So I am not really sure, I guess, like what would be the most ethical way to like go about showing that type of content and have it be like real, and if it is like trying to show some kind of message, how I guess they can best do that without like glamorizing it as a subject.
As of right now, even if the research is gently indicating that there's a correlation between seeing it visually and people doing it in real life, I think that people should probably stay on the safe side, unless they have the proper ratings for it, like R rating, to just more imply like bloody bandages, bloody, like just kind of seeing the aftermath of it and not seeing the actual bodily harm, I think would be more effective and more ethical, until there is kind of more concrete research on it.
And it's kind of interesting the way that like TV channels and networks have tried to handle this. I feel like at some point in the early 2000s, it became like the thing if a show was talking about some issue like this, that they would have like a hotline at the end, like during the credits, to say like, call this if you are feeling this way, like how it is portrayed in the show. And I almost kind of feel like shows do that sometimes, maybe as like scapegoat to like reduce the liability on themselves, basically. Like if somebody does watch that show and then does try to commit suicide, then they can be like, oh, well, we have this number, so we were doing our best, which I don't think is always necessarily the case.
For real. You know, it goes there. So we're about the halfway point now, Savannah, and I have a game that I would like to play with you just to lighten the mood a little bit, to lighten things up. If you recall, we almost talked about Vampire Diaries for this episode, and I thought it would be fun to do Two Truths and a Lie, but with Vampire Diaries villains. Are you ready?
I am ready. We'll see how this goes. I've never seen Vampire Diaries, so...
I know. This is a supernatural teen drama that I loved and I watched. It had some very questionable story arcs and plot lines, and it's going to be represented in these villains. So here we get going. So the first villain I'm going to present to you is a doppelganger of Nina Dobrev, the main character. You can tell the difference between them because the evil doppelganger wears a curly wig, and the regular Nina, Elena is her character name, just wears her normal natural straight hair. This doppelganger is the reason why the sexy Salvatore brothers are in love with Elena in the first place. The Salvatore brothers are the vampires of the Vampire Diaries. Second villain I'm going to present to you is the literal devil. He shows up in the last season. He is played by the only black villain to get a speaking role, and he is burned at the stake in the past, like, in the history flashback, for being the first psychic, and he screams so loud that he creates a dimension to hell. Last villain that I'm going to present to you is Robert E. Lee himself. He is found in the 6th season, rotting away in a locked tomb, of all places, Mystic Falls, Georgia. He is brought back by Damon Salvatore, who served under him in the Civil War, and he is brought back to help form strategy against the vampire slayer Alaric. So Savannah, tell me, which one of them is the lie?
I'm going to go with the Robert E. Lee one.
Is that your final answer?
Yes.
You are correct. It is Robert E. Lee. I was hoping, I said Georgia, and I mean, Damon really did serve as a Confederate. So there's some truth in that one. But yeah, you got it. You got it all in one.
It just sounded like too specific and ridiculous to be real.
I guess you're right. I'll get better at this. I promise.
It is funny to me though that you did pick Vampire Diaries for this, since Nina Dobrev also is in Degrassi in later seasons.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
And I am assuming this is not a spoiler for you, since I don't think you're planning to watch further. But Nina Dobrev is a main character. She plays Mia in Degrassi, and she also has a baby, but she keeps her baby and just raises it as a teen mom while she's in high school.
Oh, wow. Is she the nice girl?
She was nice. JT tried to date her, and it kind of seemed weird, like he wanted to date her maybe because she had a baby, and JT didn't want Liberty to give up the baby, but then JT got stabbed and died, so,
Spoiler warning! Spoilers. Okay, so back to the cream of the crop, really, storyline episode. It feels weird calling it that, but it was tense. It was compelling. It was shocking, really, when I was watching it, even now, as a 24-year-old woman watching this, which is Rick's storyline and his school shooting.
So, background of what led up to Rick committing this school shooting. So, Rick just kind of appears on the scene, I believe in season 3, and they don't really explain where he comes from. He just is kind of like a character who's been dropped into this universe. And he is kind of taken in by the popular kids. He has a crush on Terry. Rick starts dating Terry. This is a big deal to Terry because she hasn't had a boyfriend before. She's really struggled with her body image and never really saw herself as being beautiful. So when Rick likes her, it's a really big deal. So they start dating, and he's generally accepted by her friends. But then they start to notice, and Terry starts to notice, that Rick is being kind of possessive of her. He tries to, control what she can do, where she goes, who she hangs out with. Eventually, it all kind of reaches a boiling point where Rick hits her and her lip starts bleeding, and that's when they decide to break up. Eventually, Terry gets back together with Rick, which then leads to them having an altercation where Rick pushes Terry and she falls and hits her head and goes into a coma. So after that happened, everybody basically turned on Rick. All of his friends that he had, everybody who had accepted him, they no longer liked him anymore. And Rick, already from the get-go, they kind of portrayed him as being an outsider. He didn't necessarily dress in a quote-unquote cool way maybe Spinner did or Jimmy did or anything like that. He had glasses, he had kind of long greasy-ish hair, just not didn't wear a lot of stuff that was cool looking, I guess you could say, for the time. And they kind of showed him as having a pretentious attitude, I guess you could say. But so once everybody turned on him after he hurt Terry, it then devolved into just straight up bullying him. Because he did go back to school even after what happened to Terry, because he felt like he wanted to show people that he had changed. I'm not exactly sure if they explained that he like went to therapy or something after that happened, but he goes back to school saying that he's changed. But nobody believes him, and so they start to bully him. Like they bite him, they hurt him, they break his glasses, all different things like that. But then some people kind of come to his side, like Toby. Emma kind of comes to his side in a way, but it all leads up to them being on what are those shows called? Like the game show that they did, where it was like a trivia contest.
I don't know.
It's like one of those. It's one of those scenarios where it's like there's a school and then another school, and they're having like a competition to answer like trivia questions or math questions, things like that. So Rick is there. He's on that team, and they're like doing a good job. And it kind of seems like, oh, this could be the way that like Rick is going to redeem himself if he can like help them win. But meanwhile, in the background, Spinner and Jay, they had set up for Rick to, while he's on stage and on TV during this competition, to have like feathers and I don't know if it's like paint like dumped on him, kind of like Carrie style, if you will. And that was the breaking point for Rick. That led to him going home, getting the gun that his parents owned, bringing it to school, and then subsequently shooting people at the school. What did he kill himself? I don't remember.
It's up in the air. So kind of even going further into this little synopsis here, the situation almost gets diffused a little bit. Paige does talk to Rick, this popular blonde beauty chick, and she's like, that was really wrong of them. Like, even that was over the line for me, Paige, this mean girl. And Rick almost kind of is like, oh, okay. Like, maybe the world is more on my side. And he goes to Emma in particular, this girl, long, blonde, skinny girl that he's kind of had a crush on. And Emma rejects him too. And she's like, ew, no, Rick, I'm not on your side. Don't try to kiss me like that. And so that's kind of, again, setting him over the edge. And then again, he's put over the edge when these two teen bullies, Spinner and Jay, are like, someone who's been on your side this whole time, Drake, Jimmy, whatever. Should we just call him Drake? I feel like we should just call him Drake. Drake, who's been on Rick's side this whole time, was actually the one who set up this prank, even though it was them, so that they could push the blame off on himself. So that's what set him on edge. It all culminated, like Savannah said, into the school shooting, where Sean, this boy who's had his own history of school violence, stops Rick by kind of taking the gun from his hand, and they kind of fight over it, and it's very ambiguous as to whether Sean pulled the trigger or Rick pulled the trigger, ending his own life. That's kind of held up in the air, and Sean does have a pretty major leave of absence because he needs to cope with his own potential murder of Rick.
And Jimmy, Drake, he does get shot by Rick, which leads to him having to be in a wheelchair afterwards, but there are no known deaths other than Rick's that occur at the school.
I do feel watching this episode, it was very emotional. I can't say that I felt any more emotional rise as much as these pair of episodes brought me. Can you remember watching them in your youth, or is it too far gone, Savannah?
I do remember watching them. I do feel like they like scared me when I was a kid. I feel like if anything, these episodes might have been the ones that were like a little too much for me, like feeling wise, when I was watching them as a kid. So I think that has led to me why I haven't necessarily rewatched these ones as much. But also, I mean, it's just like a hard thing to just rewatch a lot of in general.
I did think that initially, because they do end the episode with Rick after he's been painted and feathered. He ends the episode by going home. No one's there, no parents, and he opens up this little closet, and there's a pistol in there. Don't clock me. I don't know if it's actually a pistol, a gun, and he's holding it. And I did think that he was going to commit suicide, which is what really kind of got me choked up because, teen suicide is something that me and Savannah have both seen played out in a school setting. So I did think that that was going to be the natural progression of the story. So they did subvert my expectations.
What's most interesting about this storyline in particular is just like the context in which it happened. I mean, during this time period, that's really when like we started, the conversation around school shootings was really starting to pick up, at least here in the United States. I can't really speak to what it was like in Canada.
Yeah, I think I read in an interview that they did, the director of this episode, he studied American school shootings because they're much sparser in Canada. They specifically studied the aftermath of, at the time, the deadliest school shooting in America, the Columbine, Colorado shooting. So they studied more the aftermath and the effects of the children and their psychology rather than the actual school shooting itself, because it was kind of two different situations. But Rick did this out of a breaking point. He was bullied to the point that it was torture. It was no longer funny after a while, even though he started out as this incredibly unsympathetic character. And I thought it was wild of Degrassi to have this complex, real character do this shooting.
Yeah, I do feel like in retrospect, it's kind of disappointing that that is how they made it go. I mean, it would have been a much harder sell, I think, to really show like that he's kind of come full circle and has redeemed himself. While that is possible, and people do that after having like making mistakes, especially when you're a teenager, like teenagers make mistakes. But it was probably, I don't know, I could see how that would have been difficult for them, because then maybe they would have been criticized by other people for saying like, oh, you shouldn't have let this character who was committing domestic violence like have redeeming qualities in the end. I could see how that would be like an issue for them to try to straddle if they hadn't had something really bad. But I mean, it doesn't really seem fair, I guess, what did end up happening to him.
No, I don't think it's fair. I do think that school shooting is something that should be tackled in teen media. And as you kind of mentioned before, that Degrassi does do PSA episodes. So in media, there is the young adult problem novel, which translates to TV. So they talk about young adult problems. And I do think that school shooting is an important topic to tackle. And I think it was right in Degrassi's alley. And I do think that this episode is the epitome of their tagline, "It goes there."
Specifically with this episode, it makes me think a lot about like my own feelings that I had around like school shootings, like when I was in school. And I think that can extend all the way from when I was in elementary school through college. I personally, I don't know about you, Ryan, but I was always very afraid that that was something that was going to happen at our school. Especially like while we were in high school, it seemed like there was many school shootings that started to happen. And whenever like we had to do like a lockdown, that was something that I was like genuinely afraid of. Like if it was a lockdown we didn't know it was supposed to be a lockdown, that could be a possibility of what was going to happen. I don't think I really thought about it being in the context necessarily of it being like somebody who went to our school who would do that. I more so would think of it in the context of some like outside person coming into the school. But it was definitely a very real subject for that time period. And now, still.
I don't think I've ever really been afraid of school shootings. I think that I live such a main character life where I'm like, nothing bad's going to happen to me. Everything's going to work out kind of way, even to this day. So I haven't hit a place in my life where nothing has worked out yet, but I'm sure something's coming toward me.
I'm also just generally anxious. So maybe that's just what it was. I don't know.
I think the only lockdown that I experienced, I don't know if you had already proceeded on to junior high, but in elementary school, like an old person had snuck on to like our elementary school campus, like who had a like, I don't know how to politely say this, but they were like had dementia or something of that nature, and they had accidentally stumbled upon our school, and we had to lock down for that.
Yeah, no, I remember that. I think I was there when that happened. Kind of interestingly, like today, to think about maybe what this episode would have been like today had it aired. I think it's talked about in a much more serious way, and I think a much more like deliberate way when shows choose to talk about school shootings, specifically. I think just because we've seen more of like the reality of what it is, and more survivors of these types of events have come forward, like specifically with the Stoneman Douglas High School shooting that happened in Florida in 2018. Like a lot of the kids who were survivors of that attack really stepped into the media and kind of took on a role of being an activist essentially, and like speaking out. And a lot of the parents also from that have also spoken out about things that led up to that, things that we should do to try to reform that as an issue generally. So I think that if that show had been made, if that episode had aired today, I think they probably would have done it differently. I'm not exactly sure what maybe they would have done differently. I feel like one thing that they definitely would have done differently was like the aftermath of the shooting. Like I feel like it was just really strange to me how they jumped from the school shooting to filming a movie at the school. Like, in what world is that happening? But I don't know. It just seemed really peculiar. I guess like they kind of frame it as being like that's how they're coping, I guess, and it's kind of like a treat for the kids to get to film this movie at school. But in reality, I feel like that's kind of weird and not what would actually happen. Do you have any other just like general thoughts that you had about Degrassi while watching it?
I think watching it, saw it like episode after episode after episode, really did it a disservice. I think it would have been better if I had watched reruns of the show, because everything just became so like cyclical. Does no one have a grain of empathy in them? Like I'm trying to think of, I had a specific example in my mind that I was like ranting about earlier. It's just so frustrating how everyone just overreacts all the time. Like, oh, Rick literally just did a school shooting because of bullying. And then everyone was like, we're going to bully Toby now because he was friends with the school shooter. And I mean, Toby never really overreacts. Toby's like the only golden child, and he doesn't really get a lot of screen time because he's not that attractive conventionally. So I'm sorry, Toby. It should have been better for you in these couple of seasons. So I don't know why they thought that was a good idea. Like literally they just caused a school shooting by bullying and harassing this kid so hard. And then they do it to Toby too. Like, did they not learn? Do they not? And then, and it was Spinner too. Jimmy, Spinner's best friend and the one who got shot, like refuses to forgive Spinner, which is sure its own story arc. But he causes kind of this whole other posse of friends to not reach out and be empathetic towards Spinner and not kind of understand the position that he was in. And Spinner also kind of lashes out in return. And then he resorts to becoming a Christian. Like, that's so unfair to Spinner.
I feel like my biggest issue with like the empathy thing was just always Emma. Like I feel like Emma just refused to ever think about anything from like anybody's perspective other than her own. Like whether that was Manny, like at first when Manny told her that she wanted to get an abortion, like she freaked out, or same like Emma's own mom, like early on finds out that she's pregnant and is throwing out the idea of getting an abortion, and again she just like has no sympathy or any tolerance. And I just felt like Emma just always basically like flies off the handles with everything. So that's why I don't like Emma. For numerous reasons. I feel like for me, one of the biggest issues, like rewatching it, that I would not have had this thought at all when I watched it as a kid, was just that Degrassi doesn't necessarily like look at the systems in place that like lead to these types of things happening all the time. Like, for instance, like there's several instances where they show like teen drug use or teens drinking alcohol, and they don't really like show maybe what leads up to that, or like the systems in play that would lead to something like that happening, basically, or just basically like what leads people to be more susceptible to particular things happening to them. Like sometimes it just seems like out of the blue. Like even with Ellie, for instance, like that plot line just kind of like happens all of a sudden, and we do get some indication about how her mom's an alcoholic, her dad is in the military, but prior to that, like they don't do a lot to like lead up to like, oh, maybe she was struggling with depression or like anything like that. They don't really show anything like that.
Overall, I don't think I'm going to continue watching Degrassi, because after I think season 3, it kind of went downhill for me already. It just, I think the storylines and the plot lines got a little bit repetitive. And I just became very irritated with the characters. And I'm not attached to any particular character. I don't really have a favorite just because they all are so reactive. All of them. Except for Toby.
Yeah, my favorite, like I said, is Manny. I think my second favorite is probably Paige. And I have rewatched the show kind of like various times. I used to watch it when I had like cable. I would watch the reruns occasionally. Now, since it's all on YouTube, I will occasionally watch it. I recently, just like a couple years ago, really like sat down and was focused on rewatching it at the time. But for me, it's mostly just like nostalgic at this point, both like nostalgic for the show and the drama that happens on it, but also just like nostalgic for the time period that it happened as well, like the time period of our youth, essentially.
Yeah. I can see the appeal. I think it was a very interesting case study. And I think I would have liked it if I had watched it even like in my high school years. I think I would have liked it. Also, I just wanted to point out, very unrealistic that there was no gay characters till season 2, or like the end of season 2 even. Very unrealistic. Just throwing that out there.
True. Something that I think it was kind of going for Degrassi at the time was that it was like somewhat, and I'm saying somewhat with like only barely there, but like kind of there, more diverse than like other teen shows at the time. Like I don't know a single other show that would have a Muslim character, especially not in like 2002, 2003, especially not in the US, and to have her talking about like wearing a hijab, like that's a big deal. And I think that kind of speaks, some of those things kind of speak to just the nature of differences between Canada, specifically Toronto. I know is like a very diverse city in Canada, so I think that kind of speaks to some of the differences in our media between Canada and the United States. So like we said at the beginning, there was a lot of things that we could have talked about with this episode, and it was really hard to narrow it down. So we just want to give some kind of like honorable mentions of things that we would have liked to talk about but couldn't, so we just want to say what they are right now.
Literally, we had this on the outline right now, but we had to cut it because we ran out of time. Is Paige and her rape storyline, her being sexually harassed, and the consequences of that, and how it reverberated throughout seasons. It was very long lasting.
Another one that we really would have liked to have touched on was Craig and his struggle with mental health that really lasted like the entire time that he was on the show. It was a pretty, I think later on in the series probably than RIan you got, that is like a major thing for him. And I believe he comes to terms with like being bipolar.
Jimmy and his disability, and as far as the physical disability, we also even had Spinner and his portrayal of ADHD.
And other characters as well, like Liberty and her dyscalculia, I think is what it's called. Yeah, or even I think it could have been interesting to talk about the many iterations of like chronic illness / cancer that characters go through on the show. Further than you do, RIan, than you've seen, there are several other characters who develop cancer in the timeline of Degrassi, which again kind of speaks to the cyclical nature of the show, if you will.
Of course there is. Did they go to space, Savanah? You know what they say, if a franchise has been around long enough, they eventually go to space.
Well, it is the next generation. They should have gone to space. One other last topic that I think could have been interesting to talk about was Darcy and her like bringing Christianity into the show. I think that in itself could have been really interesting to talk about as well. Yeah,
Friendship Club. We love it. So anyways, thank you so much for watching and sticking through us through all those topics. If you would like to see us tackle more about Degrassi, if you would like to force me to watch more Degrassi, feel free to comment below. Let us know what you thought. And we, again, appreciate every single subscribe, every single bell that you hit. You know we do. Savanah?
Yeah, and make sure to rate this episode if you liked it on Apple Podcasts. It helps us out a lot. And thanks for joining us today.
Bye. Whatever it takes. Yeah. You know that'll we'll make it through. Or is it I'll Make It? I skipped the theme song after a while. You know that I'll make it through. Be the best. And then in the 6th season, they stop using that because they know that not everyone will make it through.